the Eco-Modernist Podcast. Our philosophy is based on sound science and free from the outdated dogmas of the 20th century.
Hi, this is Gabe.
And this is Tom Blees.
And this is the Eco-Modernist Podcast. The recent elections has brought not just new faces to Washington, but new ideas as well. What we are speaking of is the Green New Deal that is being proposed to decarbonize the U.S. economy.
Here to speak about this is Dr. James Conca. Dr. Conca has a PhD in geochemistry and an MS in planetary science from Caltech, as well as degrees in geology and biology from Brown University. He has worked for NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Los Alamos National Laboratory. He's a weekly science contributor to Forbes Magazine and has written for The Hill and other news outlets. He has appeared on both National Public Radio and Al Jazeera. He's worked extensively in the nuclear industry, specializing in waste management. He's an advisor to state and federal agencies and to several scientific organizations.
Dr. Conca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Part of what's motivating this call for the Green New Deal is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has concluded that we have 12 years to cut carbon emissions almost in half or face dire consequences. Is that a realistic time frame?
It is not a realistic time frame because we're not doing the right stuff. It would be a realistic time frame if the entire world were on board and the United States was leading and all that kind of thing, but it's not, and that's one of the issues. It's sort of like most of these projections and estimations and plans are kind of in a vacuum. They're in limbo. An interesting exercise for the students. They're not real because there's only a relatively few humans that have bought into it.
What's being called for is a 100% renewable Green New Deal, which would eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing, agricultural, and other industries. Is that doable?
Again, it's doable if everyone wants to do it. But probably 3/4 of the humans on this planet don't want to do it. And that is the real issue. The other issue is that 100% renewable, what do you mean by renewable? The traditional renewable, which is wind, solar, geothermal, and a few other things. But if you don't include nuclear in there, you can't possibly do it. So it's just not achievable in any time frame that matters.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jim. And actually, I've written about that on our Science Council site. There are several people who I might charitably call charlatans who try to convince the world that all we need is more windmills and solar panels. But there have been a number of very rigorous studies done of those notions, and they pretty much prove beyond any reasonable doubt that you can't do it without nuclear power. If you're going to stop using fossil fuels, you're just not going to get there.
Right. Also, You have to stop using fossil fuels. So the real problem is that if you look at any of the modeling, especially the latest stuff out of IPCC, it basically shows in order to keep us to 2 degrees C, we needed to start decreasing fossil fuel by 4% a year starting in 2011, and you could still have a little bit by mid-century, but we blew that one. Then 2015 comes along, and we have to start reducing by 5% a year and go to zero before 2050. Well, we blew that one. Now 2020 is coming up, and we have to decrease by 9% per year and go to zero by 2040. That's only 20 years. And you might say, oh, well, we can do that. Sort of, except how much are we reducing fossil fuel right now? This is a trick question. We're still going up. Coal consumption grew by 36 million tons in 2017. Natural gas grew by 96 billion cubic meters in 2017, and oil consumption grew by 600 million barrels in 2017. We're not slowing down at all.
Are those worldwide figures?
Yes, worldwide figures. And again, this has to be worldwide. America can go to zero tomorrow, and it wouldn't make any difference. It makes a difference insofar as we can lead, and we need to lead. But California can do all it wants, and it's not going to do it.
When you look at the timetables, recently a bill passed in Congress to encourage advanced nuclear reactor technology. And part of it was that the U.S. would build a fast neutron test reactor at Idaho National Lab. And then they could do experiments on materials and fuels, potentially for future reactors. And people are lauding this in Washington, that this is going to be built by 2026. Well, that's 8 years down the road to build something that we already built back in the 80s and 90s. And we already tested materials and fuels, and we know how to do this. We could be building these things commercially within 2 or 3 years. And yet the government seems to think that we got all the time in the world, so let's just go do things that we've already done before. And it's incredibly frustrating and just foolish to be sitting here on our hands and pretending that this is getting us somewhere.
Wow. Why is that?
Because of fear, because of bureaucracy and regulatory maze that we have to go through. And all of the anti-nuclear stuff is based on complete misinformation and fear that was unwarranted. The purpose of the Cold War was to scare everyone about nuclear, and it worked, except it also dragged in nuclear power and made it sound like it was nuclear weapons. And they were the same thing, and it's completely nonsense. So, you can't make a nuclear weapon out of spent nuclear fuel from a commercial reactor. And it can't blow up like a nuclear bomb. But that's what the public thinks.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this, right? The Green New Deal proposed calls for building a national energy-efficient smart grid. Is there any value in that at all?
There's a lot of things that we can do that are good anyway, regardless of climate change or anything else or CO2. I mean, a smart grid is simply efficient. The costs will go down. We'll be able to conserve and all that kind of thing. That's great. The smart grid just gives you better control over the whole system, and that's wonderful, separate from anything else. Same thing with coal. Getting rid of coal is great for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with carbon. The mining is horrible. The heavy metals are horrible. So all the stuff that we want to do anyway, we should do, regardless of whether it has an effect on climate change. So smart grid is one of those great things. It's wonderful.
Yeah, also our grid is pretty antiquated at this point, and there's a lot of talk in certain circles about hardening it against electromagnetic pulse and this sort of thing. Simple things like building some extra large transformers in case something happens, because they're expensive and they take time to build, and we don't have any spares sitting around. And at one point, somebody took shots at, I think, 7 transformers and some feeder line and brought down a section of the grid in what was basically a terrorist incident. It didn't end up being a really big deal, but it did really demonstrate the susceptibility and the fragility of the grid in general. I mean, if somebody was going to do something like that on a large basis, it might take a long time to put things back together. So the idea of upgrading our electrical grid throughout the country makes total sense. And if you're going to do it, you might as well make it smart.
To clarify for our audience what an electromagnetic pulse is referring to that James spoke of, that goes back to what they call a Kensington event, or an act of war where a weapon is shot above the earth. And what these things are is that it is a super jolt that just destroys the entire electric grid, or maybe a big part of it. It is something that happens naturally from a solar flare if it's very powerful. The Kensington event was roughly 100 and something years ago, that it just knocked out all the telegraphs, just burnt them to a crisp. I'm right about that, right, James?
Yes, and also a lesser one, but it's still a big one, occurred in 1989. And again, 100 years ago, we had hardly any electrification. Now we're completely electrified and getting more so in the next 30 years. So when that next one hits, it's going to be pretty dramatic.
Yeah, and you might take note that it's not going to affect both sides. It's going to affect the side where it hits. So you wouldn't have any kind of blast effect. It wouldn't be like a nuclear bomb going off, although nuclear bombs also produce electromagnetic pulses. But, I mean, you could basically knock out a country's grid, or a good portion of a country's grid, just with the weapon detonated outside the atmosphere that people wouldn't even notice.
Let me ask you something about that. This Kensington event, which was the solar flare, if that was to happen tomorrow, and that knocked out the grid, would that also cause all our reactors to melt down?
Not at all. Nuclear reactors are the most hardened energy source there is. Pretty much they're kind of in a Faraday cage already. And a Faraday cage is just a structure that the electromagnetic field around the enclosed space. New nuclear is even better, the small modulars, the molten salt reactors and things like that. They would be not affected. What's affected is what's outside. So the high voltage electric lines that are taking the energy from the generation source to a transformer, transformers would be hurt, things like that, not nuclear reactors. It certainly wouldn't melt down.
Okay. By the way, Tom, let me ask you this. That advanced reactor that they're building, I believe that cannot melt down, right?
Fast reactor that they're talking about building?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a modified prism, which is based on the integral fast reactor technology, and so it's pretty much meltdown proof. They've done all these tests already and demonstrated it. The physics of the system just shut it down without any human interference.
Right. The same thing with the small modular reactors like NuScale. Size matters. So if you make the reactor vessel small enough, then it can bleed out heat quickly enough and it can't melt down.
Okay. I want to move on here, guys. What role, if any, do you see wind and or solar playing in this energy transition?
Unfortunately, policy is going to force it to play a huge role, and we're going to have to deal with the intermittency, which is not easy to deal with, especially when you get penetrations or amounts of renewable energy on the grid that's 15-20%. We're pretty small now. We're only 6% in this country, which is not very much. And everyone lumps in hydro with the other renewables. It's completely different. Hydro is not the same kind of intermittency that wind and solar have. So we're going to have to deal with it. It's great for getting off the grid. I have solar panels on my roof. I love them. They're great. And by the way, thank you for paying for them, all with your tax dollars.
You're welcome.
But again, if you want to get off the grid, solar and wind plus battery storage is a great way to do it. Okay, but if you're on the grid, they don't really do much because you have to have backup for them. And right now that backup is gas and hydro. And so that's not very useful in terms of getting rid of carbon. So it sounds good, but for the grid itself, for massive amounts of power, it's not very good because it's too intermittent and you have to have backup.
The thing is that all but the most fanatical and ignorant renewables advocates admit that you need backup because Germany is a classic example. It's a country that's gone the furthest and spent hundreds of billions of dollars on wind and solar. And yet there are times for like a whole week at a time when solar is producing virtually nothing for them and wind is just up and down and wherever. So if you talk with renewables advocates, any realistic one will say, yeah, we do need backup because sometimes wind and solar produces nothing. Okay, so during those times when they're producing nothing, you need a backup system capable of producing everything. In other words, capable of producing peak demand, okay? Now, if you want to get away from fossil fuels, and hydro is only available in certain places, and in certain seasons sometimes, because back when California had 3 years of drought, they were producing a lot less hydro than usual. So essentially your only non-fossil choice for reliable peak demand is nuclear. But if you build sufficient nuclear power to produce peak demand for those times when you need it, well, then you don't need wind and solar at all because the price of fuel for nuclear is trivial, and nuclear power plants are perfectly fine running at full power 24/7. So if you build a nuclear and renewable system with nuclear as a backup, then you've just built the renewables for nothing. They become like a very expensive redundancy that only adds instability to the grid.
That's why the natural gas industry is the biggest investor in renewables. The gas people, I talk to them a lot, their plan is to be 80% natural gas in America by 2050. 80%. So all this stuff about being 100% renewable is a total joke. So we're not going to get there. Now, the interesting thing about Pacific Northwest, where I'm at, is that we have about 6% wind, And all it does is displace hydroelectric. The hydroelectric is the big supplier in this entire region. So whenever the wind fires up, you have to shut the hydro down a bit. And all you're doing is displacing another renewable. So it's not doing any good in terms of carbon. It doesn't displace coal. It doesn't displace natural gas. So, it's of no use here.
It's like whack-a-mole.
Yeah, and they build on pristine mountaintops and stuff up here, which is gorgeous. And I'm sorry, I don't particularly like a bunch of huge multi-ton hunks of steel on top of pristine mountains. So there's a time and a place for everything. So if you want to build wind, it should be along Tornado Alley from Texas up to North Dakota. Tornado Alley blows all the time. The capacity factors for wind are 45%. They really run a lot. And even birds figured out not to migrate through Tornado Alley, so you don't have the bird kill. So put wind all you want along Tornado Alley. Solar, of course, is the Southwest. It's perfect for solar because, again, the capacity factor can get above 30%. But don't start building wind and solar in New England. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, yeah, but Jim, the tornadoes are going to knock down the wind turbines.
Right.
Breakthrough Institute or maybe Environmental Progress did an estimate that if you took all of the energy from all of the batteries in all of the vehicles in California, it would produce less than a half an hour of electricity for the grid. When you're talking about the vast amount of batteries that you would need to power the grid for sometimes weeks at a time, because seasonally this is really a problem, as I just talked about in Germany. I mean, it's absurd amounts. And besides which, we've already figured out energy storage, utility scale. It's called uranium.
Was saying about the small nuclear reactors, they can go up and they can follow wind beautifully, and the first one's going to be built here in Idaho is going to do that for Utah. It's going to follow wind farms. But that's, again, the same kind of thing. Instead of load following, just produce the power. So, why load follow something that has a problem when you can simply just use small modular reactors, period? You don't need to build the wind with it. We'll never have enough vanadium. We'll never have enough lithium. We'll never have enough cobalt to do what we need to do with batteries.
Let me say this about the batteries. An electrical engineer tell me this, is that if they were ever able to develop a good mass battery, that it would not be something that they would need to run the system overnight for solar, but it would be good for smoothing out the grid as a supplement. Is that true?
Why put yourself in a situation where you have to smooth out an incredibly erratic grid when you can just build nuclear power plants and just be humming along just fine?
Right. Nuclear is renewable because we are now getting to the point where we can extract uranium out of seawater, which will make it as renewable as solar.
I think there was a story once in England about, I think the prime minister was talking with the scientists, and the scientists said to the prime minister, this is the way it has to be done. And the prime minister said, well, that's impossible politically. And I think that is the conundrum that we're in. So you have a big wind industry, you have a big solar industry, they have power, and you have a lot of popular support. And even though scientifically you guys are right, I don't see how that's going to not be in there one way or the other. It seems to be something like we would have to be dealing with to some extent just because of the politics of it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak about that. There are some new designs like the Thorcon reactors, the molten salt reactors, and fast reactors. And those reactors are designed to be mass-producible modules that you could build really fast. So the Thorcon guys, who are the brothers who started the organization, are accomplished industrialists. They built the world's biggest ships. They know about building things, and they had estimated how much they figured it would cost to build these power plants for the entire power plants on a ship. Potential investors looked at it, and they thought, well, these guys are blowing their own horn. What are the numbers really? Just recently, within the last month, a South Korean shipbuilding company that used to build ships decided they were getting really interested, as were some of the other big companies in South Korea. And they said, well, we're going to give you a bid, basically. We're going to evaluate what it's going to cost to build these power ships. And the number they came up with after doing this estimate on their own dime, was almost exactly what the Devaney brothers had said. And it comes to about 75 cents a watt, which is incredibly cheap. That's on a ship that you can move around, put it wherever you want it, on any navigable waterway. So if you build these things, and they can be built within a few years, you're going to be at a point where utility companies like PG&E or whoever can buy them. And if a utility company can buy a super safe nuclear power plant for a really low price, then they're going to buy them. The economics is going to drive the system. And the more those nuclear plants penetrate power production facilities in the United States, the more people will become comfortable with them because they'll realize that they're safe. And the utility companies, they're going to want to do it. Why the heck would a utility company want to build windmills and solar panels and have all the hassle with the intermittency when they can just do this? I talked with the head of the company that's building the 2 nuclear power plants down in Georgia. He said, if I could buy a power ship and just plug it into the grid, I would do that in a heartbeat. He said, you know what a pain in the butt it is to build a nuclear power plant? Of course, he's building light water reactors, right? So I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. Yes, wind and solar politically is something that millions and millions of people think is just terrific. But ultimately, if the utility companies themselves see something that's way better, they're going to just start buying them. And ultimately, the public will come around.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. Speaking about ships, more than half of the CO2 emissions comes from large-scale shipping. Could what you're saying mean that we could nuclearize the entire shipping fleet of the world at a very reasonable price?
Well, no, I don't think that's the case, because I think it would be a long time in the future before people say, okay, we can build these little ship reactors and put them on each ship. However, that being said, certainly ships of various sizes can be run by small reactors like the Russians run their icebreakers and that sort of thing. So you could take some of the biggest ships possibly and work it out so that you could put a small reactor on them. But the thing is that if you build enough nuclear power to power your grid, you've got at least that much power and up to twice that much power just for excess. So with that, you can do like they do on the aircraft carriers. You can make jet fuel. The aircraft carriers used to have tankers coming up alongside and pulling up and filling up their storage tanks with jet fuel for all their planes, until finally somebody said, well, wait a minute, we got a dozen reactors here, and we got all this excess energy. Why don't we just make our own jet fuel at sea out of air and water? Because all you need is hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen.
How much is it going for a gallon?
It doesn't matter.
Really?
See, and this is the thing. People talk about energy return on energy invested, and they say, well, you don't want to make fuel out of air and water that's going to give you 100 joules of energy release when you use it if it takes 200 joules to make it. It just doesn't make sense. But it doesn't matter how many joules you put in to how many joules you get out. What's important is the value of the energy that you're putting in versus the value that you're getting out. If you've got a bunch of free energy to put in, then it doesn't matter. And that's exactly the situation that they find themselves in the Navy. When they got all these reactors on these ships, they got basically free energy. So it doesn't matter. You could have the same situation on a global scale if you're running everything on nuclear. Plus, you can make plastics out of it. Or anything you make out of oil now, you can make out of air and water.
Well, again, I hate to throw a wet blanket over everything, but we're 87% fossil fuel right now worldwide for all energy, including transportation. 87% fossil fuel. 10 years ago, we were 87% fossil fuel, and we've had the biggest renewable build we've ever had. And I have a feeling that by 2050, we're going to be about 87% fossil fuel. We're not going to do anything different. We're going to move around. We're going to make some cute claims, little areas like California, Germany are going to go whole hog on something, but the world at large, because they're going to get close to 10 billion people, is going to be 87% fossil fuel. And that's just heartbreaking because there's too much fossil fuel. It's too easy to get out of the ground now, and we're getting really good at it. We have drills that can pick themselves up and walk to the next site. wonderful. It's really cool from a technological standpoint. But in each one of those drills, one of those holes can have 12 stringers that go out a mile. It's too easy to get fossil fuel out of the ground, and that's the problem. It's like sitting down a bowl of candy in front of a child and saying, don't eat the candy, eat this apple.
I desperately hope that you're wrong as far
Me too.
What the mix is going to be. And I think the only way to get around it is with economics. If you can build mass-producible and globally deployable reactors for 75 cents a watt, even if natural gas or oil is 50 cents, I think if you can get the price down below $1 a watt for really safe nuclear, then that plus climate change politics will cause a global transformation. And we have to do that. I mean, if you believe that climate change is a problem, we damn well better do that. Because if you're right about the 80% fossil fuels by 2050, then I'm glad I'm an older guy.
It's going to be bad. And I hope I'm wrong, too. But the problem is it's going to take a huge nuclear bill like you wouldn't believe. Everyone just getting on board and everyone getting absolutely understanding we need to get rid of fossil fuel. Not just decrease it, but get rid of it. And the only way to do that is with nuclear. And that's it. And hydro can be built up, too, although it has its own issues. And it's politics and human nature. And we're not very good at those, especially right now. The chaos is getting worse, not better. And so it's hard to get the world moving in the same direction on any issue, let alone something like this. So that's what worries me. And I hope I'm wrong. I absolutely hope I'm wrong. But still, it's good to go anyway, even if you do not succeed to the level you think you are. Even if we don't rein it into 2 degrees, we rein it into 3 degrees C, that's great. Or 4 degrees C. 8 degrees would be devastating.
Well, I don't know. I don't see Congress doing anything like that. But let's look at something a bit more realistic. Let's look at the South Koreans, because you have some really big companies in South Korea that are quite interested in this right now. And the South Koreans generally are quite positive about nuclear power, except for the most recent president. But after he came into office on a kind of an anti-nuclear platform, they had a plebiscite, and the populace said, basically, we want to keep nuclear power. And the Koreans want to keep building nuclear plants and exporting them as well, so it's going to be a big part of their industry. But you have these big companies, including companies that own large high-tech shipyards that could build these mass-producible reactors very quickly. A small shipyard could produce 10 gigawatts of these modular molten salt reactors in a year. A large shipyard, many times more than that. And you have shipyards all over the world. The South Koreans built for the Saudis in Saudi Arabia the world's largest high-tech shipyard. And the Saudis have $1 trillion invested in a post-oil fund to figure out what technologies and industries should we invest in so that when everybody's driving around in electric cars, we can still have a vital economy. And building this high-tech shipyard was the first major project that they did, and it came online this year. Now, they would be able to build fleets of power ships and power Africa and Southeast Asia, all these developing countries, and become just a large utility company. They would retain ownership of the ships, and they would sell electricity. And if they sold electricity to, say, Ghana or Sierra Leone or wherever needed it, for half the average price of Europe, a power ship would still pay for itself in less than a year and a half. So they're looking very closely at this as a great opportunity. But, of course, the whole business with Saudi Arabia now and killing Khashoggi and everything has kind of put things on hold. But whoever ends up running the country, whether it's the Crown Prince or somebody else, they still got that big shipyard they got to keep busy. So I suspect that ultimately they're going to jump in and do it. We're talking about a few years before they could start mass producing these things. And they could produce a lot of them. And the South Korean shipyards could produce a lot of them. And then a lot of other shipyards around the world could get started at it. And countries like Russia that subsist mainly on fossil fuel income, when electric vehicles get more and more advanced, you're going to see the price of oil starting to come down. And these countries are all going to be desperate to do something. Now, the Russians, they've seen this coming, and they've been working on a lot of different nuclear projects up till now. But when you get to the point where you can just build these things on a mass-producible basis, then you can do it fast enough. and cheap enough.
Molten salt, and we're talking about fast reactors. What's the difference in what is potentially better, or is one better at certain things? How does this all shake down?
Well, you can do them all. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. Fast reactors are great because they can burn everything. And so you get about 10 times as much energy out of the same fuel from fast reactors as from a light water reactor. Molten salt reactors are kind of in between. But so you think of fast reactors as the ultimate goal in 100 years, or we're going to be all fast reactors. It'll take a while to get up there. There's still some material science issues that you need to solve, and we're doing that. So you can do it, but the question is how long will it take to get there. But you just have to go whole hog and make every nuclear reactor you can possibly think of to replace fossil fuel. That's the only way to do it. And so, yeah, it'll take some time, but just look in the past. How long does it take for some technological development to sweep through societies? Look at railroads, or look at the telephone, look at electricity, look at cars. It takes about 30 years for a new technology to displace an old one when it's part of the entire social fabric. And that's when things are really pushing. And so when there's an obvious economic or logistical value to it.
Considering that you were talking about, as we all know, 96% of light water reactors spent fuel is reusable, moving to these advanced reactors just flips the switch on that whole paradigm, and you have limitless energy. So therefore, couldn't Congress just redefine advanced reactors as being renewable?
Yeah, it should. The whole thing about renewable means you don't have to worry about the fuel. That there's a source of fuel, regardless of what it is, that's forever. So the same thing with wind and solar. I mean, yeah, the sun is forever and the wind is forever, but then it becomes the issue of capturing it and making it useful. So it's the same thing with nuclear. How do you get this energy into a useful form to generate electricity? And then, so the fuel is really meaningless.
Yeah. All right, well, going along these lines, electric consumers have contributed $37 billion into the nuclear waste fund. I mean, how feasible would it be economically to call for a vast increase in financial support by using these funds as part of the Green New Deal to expedite a rollout of the Gen 4 reactors with the express purpose of tackling the nuclear waste problem, which they're always talking about, and using this quote-unquote waste as fuel? I mean, this sounds like the solution to the anti-nuclear's big problem, and why not take that money and use it to do what, like Tom and you were talking about?
This is actually something that I've been talking to one of the senators about. And for less than $1 billion, you could build an ARC 100 megawatt fast reactor, sodium-cooled, metal-fueled fast reactor, a 250 megawatt Thorcon reactor module, molten salt, and a commercial scale recycling unit at Idaho National Lab in 3 years. And you could demonstrate the 3 synergistic technologies that you could use to power the whole planet for less than $1 billion. But are we going to do it?
Yeah, that money would be useful being spent on this kind of thing. Because nuclear waste is one of those red herrings. It's no big deal. No one's ever been hurt or killed by nuclear waste. And there's so little of it, we know how to deal with it. I mean, there's the weapons waste, the tank waste and all that goopy peanut butter crap. It's a separate thing. But commercial spent fuel is dry, it's solid, it's easy to store, it's easy to deal with. And so the idea of spending billions of dollars throwing it away is insane. That money should be used for new reactors in order to burn it, in order to make it more useful. Then that waste is easy to dispose of in the right place. So, yeah, that should be used.
Yeah, by the way, there's a great video by Kirk Sorensen that talks about is nuclear waste, where he talks about all kinds of precious elements that are retrievable from nuclear quote-unquote waste. And I don't know if it's feasible to do it at this point in time, but I just wanted to interject that. Great thing to watch.
There's a lot of platinum in there. If you take those fission products and you put them somewhere where you're going to be able to go get them later, where they're retrievable, instead of putting them into where they'd be buried in salt, you're basically creating a platinum mine for your descendants.
That's doable right now with the present technology?
Yeah, I mean, basically, all you do is you pull the fission products out, just make them retrievable because of all that platinum and whatever other elements you can get out of them.
There's a long list: palladium, rhodium, long list. It's a great video to check out. Now, getting along the lines of rare elements, is there anything in terms of like resources or manpower that would hold us back from a large build out of nuclear? And by the way, let me interject something because I just read a pretty good article about that. There are 3 resources that are claimed to be in short supply for a worldwide build out. One is hafnium, the other is zirconium, and there's one more. And niobium. Jim, you know anything about this?
Not enough. All of that is cost to mine in your rare earth element mines and things like that. We don't have a lot of rare earth element mines, and they're not very economic. Right now, China dominates that. If you need that, you can get it.
And as far as I know, for molten salt reactors, you don't need, I don't think, any of those things. I'm not sure about fast reactors. I know you want zirconium for your fuel mix, but I don't think in a quantity that would really be prohibitive.
I don't think so either. Let me quote this here from Wikipedia. Zirconium resources exceed 60 million tons worldwide. So,
yeah, I mean, zircon is a very common mineral, but actually getting it, smelting it, and purifying it for use may be a little bit more expensive than you want, but it's a small part of the total cost of nuclear. Nuclear fuel is such a tiny part of the total cost of nuclear. So, yeah, so you could double the cost of the fuel, and it wouldn't have much of an effect on the cost of nuclear power.
How about manpower? That seems to be a problem.
Yeah, it's a problem now because we're not training anyone. But if we had a huge build, that would probably take 5 years to get back. That's all.
Actually, the nuclear engineering, the universities like UC Berkeley that have big nuclear engineering programs have seen a huge spike in enrollments in the past 10 years because a lot of young people are realizing that nuclear is going to be a big thing. And some of them have even filled their programs to the point where they can't take any more students.
Yeah, I realize that. I'm looking more like welders. I understand there's very specialized welders you kind of need and people like that when you go down the chain of command, so to speak.
That's why they're talking about using shipyard techniques because the modern shipyards use robotic welding for much of their work.
Build it out and they will come. That's all.
That's right.
Yeah, you know, there's one more thing that's kind of out of the area of nuclear, but since we're talking about the Green New Deal, what about waste gas? Everything from garbage to flarings to mining to sewerage. I understand there's a lot of potential and that actually that needs to be sequestered and turned into energy because it's just creating a big problem with methane, which is 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Well, Norway and Sweden do that, but again, it's the difficulty of corralling it because it's all over the place. And I still see flares from oil rigs. So if we don't care about that and that's easy to capture, then we're not going to care about waste gas.
We need to start, though. It's my point.
And we do, and we could because again, it's been done, it's being done. But the question is, every landfill in America, you're going to put a collector in and collect natural gas. You could do that, but the cost of that is actually quite large. I mean, it's a whole new infrastructure.
Yeah, you know, I wrote about this in my book, Prescription for the Planet, which, by the way, is free. So anybody listening to this that wants to read it can go get it on our website at thesciencecouncil.com. That talked about a system using plasma so that you could basically deconstruct the molecules in garbage and pull out the carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen and use it, make hydrocarbons and make building materials out of it. And in my book, I had proposed that these be built on commercial scale because they'd only been built on a small scale up until that point. Well, Air Products, an international industrial gases company, finally built a great big one over in England. And then because of internal politics, basically, they shut the thing down and are selling it off for scrap. But there's a company called Europlasma, and they built a similar system, and it works fine, and they're starting to sell them commercially now. So the thing about garbage is it's not just what's coming out of the landfill. It's also garbage in the ocean where you have these great seas of plastic and that sort of thing. And people talk about going out and trying to pick it up and burn it or something. But you're dealing with a symptom there, and it's not really doable. It's a feel-good project. What you have to do is you have to stop it at the source, which is mainly developing countries where people throw trash into the rivers, and then the rivers bring it into the ocean concentrates it in these areas. And the way you do that is you have to make garbage valuable. If you make garbage valuable, then companies will come in and create the garbage collection infrastructure to solve the problem, and you'll start recycling your garbage. Basically, you can recycle everything using plasma systems. So these are kind of still in their infancy, but they're finally being deployed. Who knows how long it's going to take? Like Jim says, it probably takes 30 years to get technology to penetrate. Again, like with nuclear, the technology is there. These problems are basically social and political at this point.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about mass battery storage and the cobalt problem. Now, we have a big shortage of cobalt in the world, and from what I've read, I understand that they're wondering right now if there'll be even enough cobalt for the EVs that exist. And at the same time, like Elon Musk is building these super gigantic lithium ion battery systems as backup for wind and solar. I mean, isn't this exacerbating the situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, the supply is always given in terms of economics. What is economically recoverable at this time? And we don't have enough. But if you need it, you will make it economically recoverable. The cost will go up a little bit, but again, if that's where you're going, there's enough cobalt in the crust. It's going to take more funding to get it out of areas that are not economically right now. One of the issues with cobalt is also slave labor. Most of the cobalt comes from Africa, and the child labor, slave labor issue is a huge deal. There's all sorts of social and other issues that are surrounding this problem. But yeah, we can do it. And the big question is, do you really want that much battery?
Concerning the old reactors, we need in this Green New Deal to spend the money to keep those reactors open as long as possible. I mean, I think that's a no-brainer. But what is being presented, though, is that there's a problem with embrittlement.
Not really. We kind of solved that. There are different types of steels that you use that are much stronger for the pressure vessels. You can replace old pressure vessels. We've done that before. $500 million to replace a pressurized water reactor pressure vessel, but that's cheaper than building a whole new power plant. So the 40-year lifespan for nuclear reactors was not true at all. The 40-year for relicensing was simply an arbitrary number chosen by the NRC at that time. These reactors can go for 80, 100 years. It is absolutely critical to maintain them and keep them up. Embrittlement issues also involve just the type of steel you're using. So don't use a lot of borons and things like that. So we know that. It's not a big deal.
Yeah. And I don't know what happens at the 100-year point. Is it become too dangerous to shut down, or it just stops running, or I don't know?
No, the concrete will eventually degrade. So you can keep replacing it, or you can just build a new one. 100 years is so far in the future.
Yeah. People complain about sea level rise, but I don't see that as being a problem. I mean, there's such a thing as sea walls.
Sort of, except that the groundwater rises at the same time. So except for storm surge and tidal surge and things like that, huge areas of Florida will be underwater, period.
Oh, you can't do it at all? I mean, you can't just use concrete on the flooring and build up the walls?
Not for that area. The areas you're talking about. Yeah, Manhattan, sure, you're going to just build seawalls around Manhattan.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. Because they're planning on building 2 AP1000s, and they're talking about like 2 feet of sea level rise, I think, by the 2100, I believe.
You shouldn't be building anything that close to sea level.
Yeah, and that's another thing that militates for building them on ships, because it doesn't matter how much the sea rises. I just wanted to mention that companies like Terrestrial Energy and Thorcon are talking about building Those are reactors that are going to be so cheap to build that they're going to be disposable, essentially. And I think terrestrial energy figures 7 or 8 year lifespan, and Thorcon figures a 4-year lifespan because they know they'll last 4 years because we ran one for 4 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory using 60s materials. Likely they'll last a lot longer than that. It wouldn't surprise me that they'll last over a decade, but the economics are going to work well enough because, for one thing, they operate at near atmospheric pressure. So you don't need pressure vessels and high-pressure systems and that sort of thing, similar to fast reactors that also operate at atmospheric pressure. And that makes them also more readily mass-producible because pressure vessels are one of the things that has been an industrial bottleneck with building reactors up until this point. So you're not going to have embrittlement issues with those. They're just not going to last as long. The ship that you're putting them on might last 50 or 100 years, but the reactors themselves are designed just to be swapped out.
Other than how you've mentioned, is there anything that you haven't spoken of that would need to be done?
Energy is cheapest now than it's ever been in the history of humanity, ever. Because of that, food is also the cheapest it's ever been. So if you're going to do things, now is the time to do them. And if you look at different scenarios for replacing our energy sources with new mixes, they're all about the same cost in the long run. So it doesn't matter whether you're all fossil fuel or all nuclear, except for 100% renewable, which is about 3 times as expensive as everything else. But if you're looking at 30% renewable, 30% nuclear, 30% fossil fuel, and 10% other, something like that, it's all going to cost about $75 billion for the world over the next 40 years or so. And so you have the power to choose that mix. The problem is we are so concerned with short-term economics, what's profitable now, what's doable now. And again, nuclear and renewable, all the costs are up front, so everyone doesn't want to do those costs. Whereas fossil fuel, the costs are spread out over the entire time because it's all about the fuel. So it's a social decision to make. How are you going to deal with this?
That's one of the most frustrating things about being in this field is once you realize that we have the technology that we can do these things right now, and then you see that they're just not being done because basically of politics and public perception, it's incredibly frustrating, especially if you consider climate change as being an existential threat. It's just like, what? You'd like to shake the right people enough that you could get them to turn the switch on, start building these things, and we're just like clawing at them, trying to get it going all over the world, not just in the United States. And you end up bumping up against, well, like in China, for instance. The Chinese are building more nuclear reactors than anybody in the world, right? They got, I think, 20-some that are under construction and 30, 40, 50 more that they're in the process of getting started on. But that's a light water reactor industry. So you got the people in China that are doing fast reactor work and fast reactor experimentation and R&D, and you got people doing molten salt projects in China. And they're really slow, and they have hardly any money. And anytime they try to do something, the people with the power, the light water reactor people, just try to squelch them, right? So, I mean, even in a country like that, where they say, hey, we need nuclear, let's build nuclear, you're still having trouble with the advanced reactor systems that are arguably better just because the light water reactor is where the power is. And, of course, that doesn't even get into the resistance to nuclear power in general by the most powerful industries on the planet, the fossil fuel industry.
Wow. So, in other words, it's like the old story of an old industry trying to squelch a new industry in terms of light water reactors versus more advanced Gen 4 reactors.
Yeah, in a lot of places it is. Part of the problem, too, is that politicians and policymakers don't understand the technology at all. They have just the most rudimentary understanding of it. And so they can be swayed by their advisors who themselves often have ideological axes to grind. And so you end up just totally spinning your wheels.
Yeah. I would say to that, I mean, I've always said that we need to be more organized in the pro-nuclear movement. And if we were, we could actually educate our representatives about that. I wanted to ask a question, Tom, since you are the head of the Science Council for Global Initiative, and of course, Jim is on the board. What are you all up to and what are you all about?
Well, mainly what we're about is, trying to encourage the use and deployment of new technologies that are beneficial or at least benign in terms of the environment, and that can provide abundant energy for the whole world, not just for the developed countries. What we do is basically we educate policymakers in different countries around the world, try and connect them with scientists who understand these technologies, and primarily we were focusing on advanced nuclear systems. I travel to Russia a couple times a year and talk with the Russians about this stuff a lot, and with South Africa, Korea, and Japan, and the UK, and various countries. Basically, it's an educational process for policymakers.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Jim, for being on the show. And Tom, thanks for being my co-host.
Okay.
Good discussion. It's great stuff.
And now for our final thoughts. The aspirations to create a new Green New Deal is something that is long overdue. And a clean energy transition, if done right, would not only show American leadership in fighting climate change, but would improve our air quality and boost our economy as well.
But the big word here is if, because quite frankly, if it's not done right, it could easily turn out to be the death knell for both American prosperity and for climate action.
The verdict is in on 100% renewable energy. It is simply not a serious or realistic policy prescription, and if pursued, will not be the crowning achievement of the progressive movement, but rather its epitaph. And that's it for our show today. This is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Tom Blees.
We'll be signing off till next time.